Welcome to Fabric of Folklore. My name is Vanessa y Rogers, and I am your host. And in this podcast, we don't just look in the wardrobe. We don't just look at the coats in the wardrobe, but we throw them back and walk into the magical world behind the coats, into the snowy world of folklore. So we really like to dig deep. We really like to understand the history and the culture behind the stories, behind the legends, behind our traditions, so that we have a better understanding of our world and of our connections to one another. And it helps us to inform ourselves of why we're doing different things, why we celebrate these traditions in these ways, or why we tell the story in this particular manner. So I think that this is such an important topic that we are covering. And if this sounds like a fantastic podcast, please hit that subscribe button right now. And we have a fantastic show for you today. We are diving into the fascinating world of folklore and medicine, specifically contagion and contamination, where we will discuss legends and narratives, including vampires, zombies, and the Slender Man and other legends. We are talking with Dr. Andrea Kitta about her research into folklore legends and how they intersect with public health, and how folklorists are uniquely positioned to help fill in the gaps in the medical sphere in regards to contagion and public health and vaccines. Dr. Andrea Kitta is a folklorist with a specialty in medicine, belief, and the supernatural. Her current research includes vaccines, pandemic illness, contagion, and contamination. And she has been awarded several accolades, including for her most recent book, The Kiss of Death, Contagion and Contamination of Folklore, including the Chicago Folklore Prize, Best Book of Folklore Scholarship for that year, which I think was 2020. She is currently a professor at East Carolina University. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited about this show today.
Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
So I always like to ask our guests basically their origin story. Help us to understand how you got into folklore, and then how you got into the realm of medicine in folklore.
It's a great place to start. So I think there was like early indicators that I was going to be a folklorist when I was a kid. So like retrospectively looking back, I was like, I was obsessed with so many things like ghost stories. And I think my family let me rent Poltergeist like a dozen times. And I was obsessed with Ghostbusters too. That was another big like thing for me as a kid. When I would go to the library, I would take out all the books on mythology and all that. So I think there were some early indicators, but I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do when I got to college. So I started out as a history major because I liked stories and I liked history, and I knew that. So I started out as history. And then I was, I really liked the oral history part of it. But then I kind of, at the time in history, oral history was great if it collaborated with what people already knew. So it wasn't used as its own form of evidence. And I thought, that's kind of not right to me. Anyway, I had graduated and I was taking a couple of classes just for fun. And I ended up talking to this grad student, and I was like, these are all the things I like. And he was like, you should be a folklorist. And I was like, oh, what? I had never heard of it. I did not know anything about it. And he's like, yeah, this is like, you should go home and look into it. And I went home and looked into it and like immediately started applying for programs. So I was like, yep, this is it. This is exactly what I want to do. Sorry. Sorry, I'm still getting over something here. But yeah, it's one of those things where I think like it makes perfect sense now, but at the time I just had no idea what I wanted to do. And I was like, is this even a thing? But yeah, I found out it was a thing. So I did my master's at Western Kentucky. And then I went on to do my PhD at Memorial University in Newfoundland. So that's what I ended up doing. And then I got a job
in Newfoundland. Where is Newfoundland?
It's off the east coast of Canada. So it's an island.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great folklore program. So everybody should go. It's also beautiful. Like Newfoundland is amazing. It has like icebergs and whales. And it's just like the whole place is magical. Like when I got there, I felt like I had moved to like some sort of like magical fairy realm because it was like this on the ocean, and there was like, it was just, yeah, it was insane when I got there, and I was just like, this
So is
place
it
is
freezing there?
amazing. It's
Is it
not
really
that
cold?
bad. It's really not that
Okay.
bad. It snows a lot.
Sometimes coastal cities
Yeah.
are a little bit more temperate.
They are, yeah. And this is one of those places where it snows a lot. Like, I'm not going to say it
Hmm.
doesn't snow because it does. But it's always just like in the winter, it's like right around freezing. It doesn't like get super
Oh,
cold.
yeah.
Yeah. So
That's
like when I lived,
manageable.
yeah, yeah, when I lived in Pittsburgh, I got colder there. So,
Hmm.
so it's pretty manageable because of the airflow, but it does snow a lot. But it's just, yeah, it's this amazing, just incredible place. I absolutely love to go be living there. I would move back in a heartbeat if I could. But yeah, so it was great to be able to study folklore in like such an amazing setting too.
Well,
So.
and I think
Mhm.
folklore is kind of in its own bubble. I have a degree, a communication degree, and then I have a
Mhm.
master's in business. And I had never heard of the term folklorist until I started this podcast,
Oh
until I
wow.
started like researching folklore. And so,
Yeah.
um, I feel like it's an area that I am very much interested in. And so
Mhm.
it's, fascinating that so many people, a lot of the folklorists that have come on, they had never heard the term either. So it's just interesting that it's just kind of like in its own little bubble that not a lot of outsiders know about, but it's
Yeah.
such a fascinating realm of topic.
Yeah, and it is so, I love it so much. So I'm so happy to talk about it because yeah, it's exactly like I'd be doing this stuff even if I wasn't a PhD in it. So
Right.
or a professor, I'd probably still be doing all this stuff anyway. So it's
That's
nice I get paid
hilarious.
for it. So
So when did the medicine part come into your research? When did that start to become your focus?
yeah, it was always kind of there because I was always really interested in medicine. And I was especially interested in urban legend and how urban legend affects medical decision making, because I
Hmm.
knew there were so many stories, and I thought, oh my gosh, we treat people in so many different ways based off these stories that we hear, and that's especially true in medicine. But then we
Hmm.
also make decisions for our own bodies about these stories
Hmm.
that we hear too. So I thought, oh, that's fascinating, and I was really interested in how you can present people with the same information and people will make totally different decisions. And I was like, why is that? Like
Yeah.
why are some of us like really into, we want the numbers and the facts, and other people are
Right.
more, in tune with stories, or some people like both. Like why does that happen that way? Like how do our brains work that make us, want
Hmm.
these things? So I thought that was really fascinating. And I thought it was so interesting to me that so many people were making like real decisions about their own health based off of information that they just heard somewhere, and like some of it was
Right.
true and some of it's not. And like that's a good thing to know about folklore is sometimes folklore is, it's not automatically false because it's folklore. It's like it can be true. So it was so interesting to hear. They're like, well, I heard from this person that they had this really bad time with this, one surgery or something like that, so I'll never do that. And it's like, well, yeah,
Right.
but that was like one instance. Like
Right.
there's, what about all the evidence? And so I was like, it's really interesting what sways people. So I was really fascinated about that, and like even what caused me to make different, medical decisions. So like why was I
Mhm.
okay with some things and not okay with other things, and so like that really, I don't know, that really fascinated me, and I guess it still does because I haven't stopped studying it yet. I haven't figured it out.
Yeah.
So
Well, and this came up for me a lot because I've given birth in a hospital, and I before when I was pregnant, I kept hearing all these stories about how the United States, for in industrialized countries, has one of the highest maternal death rate, and they kept talking about the reasons behind that, and one of it was that the medical community, there are all of these beliefs, misunderstandings, especially around the minority women, about how they feel less pain and how they're not believed as much, and that there's these stories going around in the doctor community that really affect this high rate of maternal deaths, which is
Mhm.
just mind-boggling to me because we have great medical schools and it's just and
Yeah.
facilities, and I just don't understand how this could happen.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to see. And there's been so many studies, just study after study, not only on that, but on other things too. Like I know there was one study that came out that said that when it comes to understanding menopause, doctors actually rely more on what their mother's experience was like than what the actual medicine is like. So they're
Yeah.
like their believability, like how much they believe a woman when she's talking about her symptoms, it
Yeah.
totally depends on what their mother's experience was. And like that was like, I was just sitting there like, that's mind blowing. Like you of all people know the science, right? Like you
Yeah.
actually have had this training. But that's so true, especially when you're looking at maternal health care. There's so many things out there that people just don't understand, and they're leaning in to these ideas that are just simply not true, and based off of like really old ideas too, especially like when you're
Hmm.
talking about like the perception of pain. I mean, that was something that was said when people were enslaved, right? That
Hmm.
this was okay to do because they didn't feel pain in the same way that white people did. And it's just like, oh
Right.
my god, no.
Just a rationalization for why you can hurt someone.
Exactly, and so much of that is based off of that. And I was having this whole discussion the other day with a friend who was having some surgery done, and the doctor was talking about like, oh, I have to get these angles on your face correct for certain things. And when she actually looked into the research on that, the angles on the face that he perceived as correct were someone that was like involved in eugenics, and was saying that like the Caucasian form
Wow.
is the perfect form, and was like all like was relying on
Yeah.
information, and they had no idea. That's the worst part, is the doctor
Right.
had no idea that's what that was based off of. That was just what he was
Hmm.
taught, and was like, oh, okay, like this is the stuff you do. You want to make sure that the face looks natural after, a facial reconstruction. And it was like, no, this stuff is so much based on this doctor from I don't even know how many years ago that was completely relying on Caucasians as being the perfect human form. And it's like, oh
Right.
my god, like, that blew my mind. And I was like, oh gosh. And he had no idea. She told him, and he was like, I had no idea. And even he was shocked by it. So I think too that like things get taught to you and you don't know the cultural history of it as well. And like, so that, sometimes you don't know that these actually came from people who were, functioning under this idea of, one race being superior, or, these
Right.
horrible ideas. But there's so much out there that's still, influenced by that. And I think we forget that. So yeah, these little things throughout healthcare, and yeah, the maternal pain thing again. There was a study that was done, I think, only a couple of years ago, and they asked medical students how many of them believed that, especially Black women, like have less pain, and it was like 70%. And I was just like overwhelmed by this number, because I was like, how have we not gotten rid of that? But
Yeah,
it's
and
still
is it in their medical textbooks? Where is that even coming from? Are they just telling stories within their own classrooms? Like,
yeah,
how is that infiltrating? That
it
is so
is.
fascinating.
It is, and there's this really great anthropologist named Emily Martin, and she had done a lot of work like in the '90s on this stuff. And one of the things she actually studied was grand rounds. So it's like when the doctors present cases to each other, and they kind of like talk through, and they learn from each other. But one of the things she noticed in grand rounds is, even if you're a person of color or you're a woman, you still
Mhm.
describe things as using the white male body as the ideal body.
Wow.
And it didn't
Yeah.
matter. It did not matter, because all that stuff was so indoctrinated
Ingrained.
into what they were learning, that even if you weren't the ideal body, you still compared it to their perception of the ideal body, which was white and male. So
Hmm.
yeah, and that was just like, oh my gosh, how is that possible, even for people of color and for women? But it's because it is, it's an indoctrination. It gets ingrained into the way that you're taught. And I mean, you
Hmm.
go to school for a really long time for medicine, so there's plenty
Right.
of opportunity for that to be reinforced. So, yeah, it's really shocking, like how many times it comes up.
And I think it's starting to be brought to light a little bit more. I've read a couple books recently that
Mm,
were historical fictions, like the what was it? The book Woman of Troublesome Creek and The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks
yeah.
both kind of brought to light some of that systematic racism. But I definitely think
Mhm.
that it's a topic that really needs to be brought more into
Right.
focus into the medical world.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something we should be talking about, medicalized sexism and medicalized racism all the
Mm-hmm.
time, because it happens over and over. And sometimes we don't even, like, a lot of doctors don't even realize they're doing it.
Yeah.
So it's, it's something we actually have to point out to them and say, like, maybe you need to look at how you're speaking to women about their pain and believing them if they're in pain. So like,
Yeah.
how many times do you give an MRI to a guy that you don't give to a woman, right?
Right.
Like that kind of stuff.
And those are things that statistics can root out and help us to see what stories are actually infiltrating, because people don't really they don't know, because a lot of culture is just, like we said, is so ingrained that we don't even know it's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think because you've heard a story so many times, you don't question it, right?
Mm-hmm.
When I was first doing my research for my dissertation, I actually found this legend in Newfoundland that I started calling the doctor from Toronto. And it was this story about a family that had come into the hospital for some other reason. It was like something like the kid had a fall or something, but they brought their child into the hospital for not an infectious disease or anything like that. So it's usually like a broken bone, something silly like that. And the doctor finds out that the child is not vaccinated, and they actually call child protective services and say that this
Mm-hmm.
is, this is like the
Right.
level that they take it to. And so many of the people in Newfoundland, the doctors in Newfoundland that told and retold the story over and over again, were sort of telling it in this way, like, but we're not like that. Like that's
Mm-hmm.
people in Toronto. So it was also a commentary on like the different parts of Canada and how they feel about each other. But
Yeah.
it was also this idea too that like this is important, and like in other
Yeah.
places this could happen to you, so you better
Mm-hmm.
get your kid vaccinated. So it wasn't just this like you should do it for medical reasons, you should do it
Right.
too so that like your child isn't
The
taken
government
away from
doesn't take a
you. Yeah,
right.
and I mean that's like a big threat if you really think
Right.
about it.
Yeah.
Like the threat of having your child taken away is terrifying. So this
Mm-hmm.
was a story that even though they'd be like, well, I won't do this, it was still like this, a little bit of a threat still there.
Right.
And then it was so funny because I tried to track this down to just find out, like, how did the story start? And every time I'd find somebody, they'd be like, oh, yeah, I heard it from one of my professors. And then I'd like track down that professor, and he's like, well, I heard it from one of my professors. And I'm like,
Yeah.
how old is this story? And it was so hard. Like, I thought, oh, it's got to be new enough. Maybe I can track down some origin, or at least
Yeah.
get back to like some kind of place where a lot of people heard it. Couldn't do it. Just like most folklore, you can never find the origin. So
What do you call that in folklore? Because like in medicine, you call that patient zero, right? Like the origin of medicine. What do you call it in folklore?
It doesn't happen very often, so I don't know if we have a term, but we actually do. So, like a lot of times, especially in the past, when we were trying to figure that out, a lot of people would call that the story. So you are after the first city.
Uh-huh.
And then we found that there's no way to really find it. So
Yeah.
that was like, especially when you're talking about something that's been around for a long time. Now the internet's a bit different. Like we can actually track things on the internet. So
Mm-hmm.
like I can tell you the exact post that started the Slender Man story, but I can't necessarily tell you anything that's a bit older than that. So, because there's always this idea too, even if we find it in print, it's probably been in oral circulation before that.
Right.
Right. And then
Exactly.
trying to figure out when that started, it's like, oh God. And then finding out if that's continuous, right? Because sometimes things die out and then they come back. And it's not that they've been told in between. It's just it totally died out, but we thought of it again, right?
Right.
So there's ways to kind of see how these things change too. And so like things like jokes will change to like different people. So like, like when I was a kid, it might have been a Michael Jackson joke, but now it might be somebody else that they tell the joke about. So,
Yes.
so your celebrities change and your jokes, those kind of things change. So that's also hard to track then too, because it's like, well, maybe the story wasn't told about a doctor in Toronto. Maybe it was told about a doctor someplace else. And
Yes.
so then it becomes really hard to find out where did this thing exist, especially, like I said, with the oral tradition. There's no evidence, right? There's no like printed forms. So we can go back in
Yes.
printed forms, but like how far back does it go before that? Who
Right. And you
knows?
can't track down dead people, and you can't
Yes.
interview them. And so
Not yet, at
there's a
least.
stopping point.
That would be a really interesting study, though, if we could figure that out. That'd be great.
Yeah. When you're able to start talking to ghosts, that's the key, right?
Yes, absolutely. That'd be really hilarious. I could just see like maybe like pulling out a Ouija board or something and being like, all right, we're gonna track this down.
That's hilarious. Folklorists and mediums come together.
Yes, yeah, we're going to work together. And
so when did the subject of contagion and contamination start to really fuel your interest?
Yeah, it's kind of accidentally. I realized I was looking at all the different like sort of presentations and things that I was publishing and like the stuff I was interested in. And I was like, oh God, there has to be some kind of thread here. Like, what am I doing? Like, there has to be something that's common. And I was sitting there thinking about like what is the common thread in my work? And then it like just kind of hit me. Like, it was like one of those shower moments, like one day where I was like in the shower and I was like, oh, it's all about contagion and contamination. That's everything I do is about that. And I was like, oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Cause I was thinking about Slender Man. I was thinking about, I was teaching these classes on like zombies and vampires. I was, working with vaccines and medicine. I was like, okay, something has to bring all these things together. And I was like, okay, that's what it is. Like, that's the underlying thing that's happening here is that everything I'm doing is talking about that idea of being contaminated or being contagious. And so it took me a little while to get there, but I did. Yeah. And it's so funny because when I put the Kiss of Death together, I remember like applying for this grant to try to get like a little bit of course release. So I had some time to write. And everybody was like, this is super interesting, but there's no way she can bring this all together. And I was like, challenge accepted, like, you can do this. I'm like, I know. I'm like, watch me. I'm like, I know it's all up here right now, but it is up here. I know how it all connects. And I'm glad I made it all connect in the book, hopefully.
Did you have an entire floor filled with like strings and ropes and yarns trying to connect things to one another?
It's not that far off, but yeah, there were definitely documents and there was writing and there was literal like sometimes when I'm writing too, I get to a point where I'm like, I cannot look at a screen anymore. So I print everything out and then I literally cut and paste. Like I cut it and I like tape it all together and I'm like, okay, yeah, this works, So it does. It's like a little bit like, but maybe I need the red strings. Maybe that would be better.
Yeah, like the FBI do.
Yeah, I just have that. I mean, I study conspiracy theory too, so why not?
Why not? So, this book came out right around when the pandemic was happening, but you started it beforehand.
Yeah.
How far in advance did you start this book?
I probably started writing it in like 2015, I think. And so, and it came out October of 2019. And that was, I mean, I couldn't have timed that if I tried in a million years. But it is kind of funny though, because like I tell people, I've had a pandemic, like what happens if we have a pandemic on my syllabus since 2009.
Right.
So I've been kind of knowing that a pandemic was coming. We're overdue for one, and
right. Epidemiologists have been saying for like decades that we were due. We were right for a pandemic, and it just had not occurred for so long.
Yeah, I mean, and that's just it. We were so overdue for one. So I was like, oh, it's going to happen. So yeah, I had a statement on my syllabus. It's like, and it said like, because I live in North Carolina, it says like, in case of hurricane, pandemic. I was like, hurricane more likely, but pandemic also.
Well, at one point I had heard that the CDC actually has a zombie contingency plan. Yes. And they don't actually believe that, zombies that people die and come back, but something similar, where people are not themselves. And is that something that you've seen or studied?
Yeah, actually, I wrote a little bit about it because I thought it was so interesting that they kind of did it as like a joke, like a Halloween. I remember if it was Halloween or April Fools that they did it for. But they were like, but at the same time, this is all useful information for any emergency.
Right.
But we're going to do like the how to survive a zombie apocalypse. They actually tried to follow up with a vampire one. And I think it was vampire nutrition. I can't remember, but it was not as popular. But the zombie apocalypse one was. And yeah, I thought it was a really creative way to get people's attention, right? Because a lot of the stuff they were talking about is good in any emergency. But yeah, it was really interesting to see that they had done this kind of like tongue in cheek, like, haha, isn't that funny? But like a lot of people were like, took it kind of seriously. And they were like, oh my God, the CDC put out a zombie pandemic guide. Like, what are we going to do? It's like, we're probably going to be fine. But
That makes me want to read it now. I never actually read it, but now I want to
it's pretty good.
Well, we'll put a link up on our website. And that way that people can access it. Maybe if we can get a link to the vampire one too as well.
Yeah.
That would be good. So did you see any historical similarities between past epidemics or pandemics that we saw in this most recent one?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think probably the two that kind of came up a lot were HIV/AIDS and the 1918, what's usually called the Spanish flu. And those two, I definitely saw some similarities between those as somebody that's, kind of looked at both of those and studied them. And I think actually it was really interesting because at first when I started thinking about HIV/AIDS, I was like, this is like, is this something that is good? Is it a good comparison? And it really is for so many reasons. And a lot of them have to do with stigma and that idea of patient zero and blame. And so there was so much there about, if you don't, and so much as the whole reason these stories exist is so that we can feel like, if I just don't do these things that patient zero did or that person did, then I'm safe, right? And that gives
sense of control.
Yeah, a sense of control and some comfort. So it was, especially HIV/AIDS in the US, it was like, okay, well, I'm not gay, so I'm fine. And it's like, no, you're not. That's not exactly, there's a whole bunch of other reasons. There's a whole other different ways that this spreads. Which is really interesting too, because if you go to a place like Africa, it spread much faster in heterosexual couples, whereas it was different in the U.S. So depending on where you are too, like what stories you heard, they may have reflected you or they may have not. But there's so many people that went, and they looked at, especially Gaitlin Dugas, who was the patient zero for HIV, and they looked at his lifestyle, they looked at his job. He was a flight attendant, and they made assumptions about what his activities were, what he was doing, and said to themselves, well, I just won't do that and then I'll be fine. It's like, but that actually, none of that was true, right? Like it was a very well crafted and created narrative that was actually created. It wasn't even created by somebody that was in like the CDC or anything like that. It was created by an author. So it was just an individual person who was like, yeah, this guy seems like the prototypical HIV patient. I'm going to call him patient zero. And so many people thought that he was, and he really wasn't. So his name and his reputation was really just destroyed because of that. And I still think about that. And I think even too of like people like Mary Mallon, who we usually refer to as Typhoid Mary. She was somebody that just was, she was just a working class person that was just trying to make money. And they kept telling her, like, don't do the job, the only job you have to do, the thing you're good at, don't do that anymore. I will give you no other options on how to make money, right? So like, how are people supposed to survive, right? People don't think about that kind of stuff when they do this. But I mean, she ended up dying in isolation because she was eventually placed basically in containment for the end of her life, which is just tragic. So many of these people, when we look at this in the blame, there's so much that happens to those individuals, and it's really sad.
Yeah. And so did we see that in COVID-19? I don't remember any stories around like a patient zero.
No, we didn't do it to individuals. We did it to groups though. So
right, because I feel like China got blamed for a lot.
China got blamed for a lot. That was a big part of it, and a lot of it was surrounding, especially, and this is one of the things we love to do, especially in urban legends, is talk about what people eat. And that was a big part of the whole Wuhan wet market idea. And of course that, like, even that term is terrible. And I get that it's like the translation and it works. But a wet market is just a farmer's market, right? And like, I think it would have been a different idea if somebody would have said the Wuhan farmer's market versus the wet market, right? I was
thinking in my head that it was a seafood market, but it's a farmer's market. Okay,
they have perishable goods, which, I mean, I go to farmers markets that have perishable goods too, and that's just the difference in China between a dry market and a wet market. Is is it perishable? So, and like I've gone and bought meat at a farmer's market, right? Like we all go and do this. I bought eggs, I buy, perishable goods. And so that's all this was too, was a market that had perishable goods. And at the beginning there was this idea that it was related to bats, and then people immediately went to not our close contact with bats, which is what it actually is, but people were eating bats. And like that sounds gross, right? Like we don't think of bats as like being a good food to eat. And I mean, there are people in the world that eat it. In some places it is still eaten the same way that there are places in the US that we eat squirrel. I mean, we eat all kinds of wildlife, but we just decide which ones are gross and which ones aren't. And it was so funny too, because so many of especially there's a particular picture that everyone had. And it was like this, it looks like a bowl of almost like wonton soup with like a little bat on the edge. And every time I see this picture, it makes me laugh because it's like the bat's like a garnish almost. It's the most ridiculous picture. And it just like, I'm sorry. I don't think you'd like, if you're having bat soup, you would put like the bat in the soup. You wouldn't just
absolutely not. No,
put it on the edge. Like it's just, also you'd probably eat a bigger bat, right? Instead of this like little tiny bat.
Yes, I guarantee. I lived in South Korea for a while, and I remember one time I went to this restaurant and we just had, a beef dish. But at one point we were walking out, there were Koreans having this soup, and I was like, that smells so good. What is that? Yeah. And they all started laughing, and my Korean friends translated that it was dog soup, because Koreans eat primarily males. For virility's sakes, they eat dog. And so like I was horrified because it's not typical in America. And so they all thought it was hilarious, my reaction to this delicious smelling soup. That I was now appalled that I thought that this soup smelled delicious. So but I can guarantee that there was no advertising of a dog next to that soup.
Yeah, just next to it, like, like
no.
Yeah, so it's so funny, and I think of that too, because I've actually been to Wuhan, I've been to China, and I've been to the wet market, so I knew exactly what it looked like. But it was really funny because, like, speaking to that, I remember when I was in China, they were asking, like, we were at dinner, and they're like, do you want to eat? And I was kind of going through, what, this is fine. And they were like, do you want to try donkey? And I was like, yeah, sure. If you guys want donkey, we can have donkey. Like I'm open to trying things. I was like, maybe it's great. I don't know. And anyway, it came to the table and I had some and it was fine. And I noticed nobody else had it. And I was like, you guys not going to have any of this? They're like, oh God, no, we would never eat that. I was like, guys, why didn't you tell me? Like, I thought you guys were
why did you order for me?
Yeah, I didn't order like specifically. Like it wasn't like on my bucket list to eat a donkey, but and they were like, oh God, no, that's disgusting. We wouldn't eat that. I was like, God, why'd you tell me? But it's so funny, like what is disgusting versus not disgusting to us, right? And sometimes it's necessity too. People eat things because there's nothing else available, right? And that's unfortunate, but that can also be a part of that, right? There's also a class issue here too. So yeah, when I saw that stuff about bat soup and the wet market, I was just like, oh no, here we go. Like here it's classic urban legend stuff, right? Kentucky Fried Rat, all those things all over again. And this idea that people that are foreigners or people that are not like us eat weird things. And that's gross and disgusting, which, then reflects on them as being gross and disgusting. When we all eat weird stuff, like I think about that, like we eat cows, we eat squirrels, we eat all kinds of weird stuff that I'm sure people in other places are like, oh my God, I can't believe they eat that. And here we are doing it. So yeah, I think about that a lot. But yeah, that was one of the first big things I noticed. And then of course, like a lot of the because we have new information, it shifts to the raccoon dogs. And then everybody's like, oh my God, who's eating raccoon dogs? And it's like, oh my gosh, they're mostly used for fur. So they would have been there. Do people eat them? Absolutely. Probably somewhere. And probably out of desperation. I don't know what they taste like, but people were like freaking out about it. And I was like, oh, why do we always go back to eating instead of living next to, right? And that's what it is. Like these diseases jump species because of our close contact. And the more that we do things like deforest areas, the more these things are going to come in more close contact with us. So like I have bats in my backyard, right? Like that's just normal for where I live. We have lots of bats. I put up a bat house for them because I want to encourage them because they eat mosquitoes.
Yeah.
And that's great. Yeah.
I want bats in my yard.
Yeah, why not? Like, yeah. So, I mean, it's not like this thing could happen here too, right? Because we're in close contact with animals as well. I live in an area that has a lot of pig farms and stuff happens, right? And we all know that if you live on a farm or anything like that, you know about this. Like, you know about these diseases. They can jump species. And our big concern, of course, is when it goes from animal to human, concerning. But when it goes from human to human, that's when we've got a problem, right? So that happens all the time. And all of our common diseases are from animals. Like the flu is from birds, right? Like I always love when people say avian flu, because it's like, yeah, that's pretty much most of them. So it's not just birds, but there are other types of flu too, as well. There's swine flu and other kinds. But yeah, that idea that that this is something that happens in other places, or has happened because of a lab leak. Probably not true. It's just our close relationship.
Right. So did you see any legends that came back to life from other epidemic times? I'd love to hear some of those.
Yeah, and this actually goes back to the 1918 one. So there are people protesting masks in 1918.
Yes, I remember reading about that.
So that was a big one. I mean, so that coming back with the idea that masks don't work, which I've heard in other places as well. And at different times. That actually came up too during the SARS epidemic. So that was, a more localized epidemic, not a pandemic. But yeah, there were people talking about how masks don't work. Anti-Asian hate towards that one as well, especially because a lot of it had to do with a specific area in Toronto. So there was so much associated with that. So I saw that kind of coming back, the ideas that masks don't work or they're ineffective in some sort of way. All of the stuff too about if you're tough enough or if you're like healthy enough, you can overcome this. You have an immune system, it'll be fine. And like, not only is that like just awful for people who, have medical conditions or are immunocompromised in some way. It's just terrible to tell them that they're like not tough enough or something. Like that's just ridiculous. But it also affects healthy people, right? And so it wasn't that, you'd be fine. A lot of people who are very healthy were not fine, right? They got COVID and they died, or they got COVID and they had really bad reactions. And that was, we've seen that coming out too with long COVID, where most of the people who have had long COVID, they tend to be women, but they tend to be people who are active. Right. So it's not that these were immunocompromised people, that they had any sort of health conditions. They were, completely healthy people that unfortunately developed long COVID in the long run. So, there's so many things there you see. So those kind of stories came back. Yeah, those stories about what we eat, the stories on who to blame. College students were another group we like to blame as well, because they had big parties. So any kind of super spreader event, I think was our new patient zero was the super spreader event. So, weddings, funerals, graduations, big events like that. And I always talk about the college student one because that actually happened here. So when the news came out that there was this big 400 person college party, that was here at the university that I teach. And I was like, oh no, we're in the news and not for a good reason. But yeah, I mean, that's what happens though, when you bring people together who haven't seen other people in a long time. Of course they were going to have a party, and everybody has gone to a party that has gotten out of hand, right? Like I have been to that party where it was supposed to be just a couple of people, then all of a sudden like more and more people just keep showing up and you're like, oh, it's that kind of party. Like, so parties get out of hand. Like that just happens, especially at the college level.
People just start inviting people.
Yeah, exactly. Somebody else calls and says, hey, there's a lot of people over. And yeah, all these people end up showing up. And I think that's exactly what happened. And it was, all this blame on the students and not on the people who brought them back, right? They just did what people do, especially young people do when you bring them together, like when you put them all together. Yeah, of course they're going to hang out and have fun. So yeah, and then we blame the students instead of blaming the people who brought them to put them in that situation, which I thought was kind of cruel to do. Yeah, and then we, let them get all good and COVIDy and sent them back home. So that was a whole other issue. Not happy
Did
about
you
that.
did you see differences in the legends in different countries or in
Yeah,
different places?
yeah, absolutely. Um, One of my favorites is the origin legend and how it works out in different places.
Uh-huh.
So it was really interesting because I had a friend in Hong Kong at the beginning of the pandemic, and she was telling me some of the stories she was hearing, and a lot of what was being said in places in Hong Kong was that it was a lab leak, or it was something that the Chinese created to take out America, but instead of
Yeah.
doing it successfully, that they had like messed up somehow, like somebody had like dropped the bottle or like
Yeah,
something
I
and
think
it
I
happened
heard
there
that one.
instead.
Yeah, I think I heard
Yeah.
that one.
Yeah. And then in China, there were people saying that it was the American military that did it. And they had this really specific, it was like two men and one woman that they like purposefully infected that were military personnel and then sent them out to the Wuhan wet market. And that was the rumor that had gone on in China was that it was an intentional spread by the US
Mhm.
government and to
Mhm.
make China look bad. So yeah, so there was a lot of different ones there, and then like the reasons. Like I remember reading this one from a Ukrainian research center that was talking about how this was like the EU trying to get back at the UK for Brexit. And I had just not heard that because, of course, why would I? I live in the U.S. So,
Yeah.
yeah, so it's like so different. And then the other like there was other ones where it was like it was everywhere. It's like, oh, well, they're just doing this to sell vaccines, or they're doing this as population control, so they don't have to pay out like as much Social Security or this kind of stuff. And you're like, oh my gosh, this is weird that we have some of the same ones everywhere, but then others like some of those little details were different, but then other legends were only in certain places and they just didn't go anywhere else. And yeah, so it was interesting to kind of see what was sort of like a version of it was everywhere, and of course with like different details, but the ones
Yeah.
that really kind of stuck. That was pretty
Do you feel
interesting.
like I feel like as we've become more ingrained in this information culture, there's a lot more distrust of governments. Did the legends seem to change to reflect that?
Mhm.
Was there this distrust of governments during these other past epidemics as well?
Yeah, there was definitely like this idea that the government is controlling too much, that they should leave this up to individuals. So
Hmm.
that was definitely there, and it's actually really fascinating if you look at the history of vaccination. Um, the arguments are almost identical against vaccination.
Mm-hmm.
It's all stuff like it's against God's will. It's
Hmm.
we're contaminating our bodies by putting in these animal elements. Like it's the same since Edward Jenner's time. Right?
Hmm.
And that blows my mind that we're still doing the same arguments. And like there's a little bit of tweak here and there, but it's still that instead of against God, it's against nature, or instead of there's like these little tiny like changes. But yeah, we've been saying the same kind of stuff, like, especially about vaccination since it was invented. So those arguments just keep happening over and over again. And
So
so
it
yeah,
just comes in waves and different ways.
yeah, it does. And we also see too that like a lot of places that had because I mean, sometimes things happen, right? Things like the Cutter incident, which is where in the I think it was the 1950s, they when they were manufacturing the polio vaccine, it was not properly attenuated, it wasn't properly killed. And it actually ended up infecting children instead of preventing it.
Oh,
And we
because
also
was it a live vaccine?
Yeah, it was a live vaccine, and it was supposed to be killed, and it turned out to be live. And
Oh,
yeah, so this was
hmm,
kind of old school vaccine manufacturing technique. Now that we have
yeah.
mRNA, it's so different. But yeah, and some children got infected, and some children died. And in
Mm-hmm.
that area, that happened in California, and in that area, like that story and the influence of that stayed in the cultural memory, right? So these
Mm-hmm.
places where have had things like this bad happen have
Mm-hmm.
stronger anti-vaccination movements. But of course, now with the internet,
Mm-hmm.
everything's everywhere, right? And you can kind of get that information even when you're just looking for like just basic information about like vaccination or diseases or things like that. You can find so much bad information, which is so sad. The
Yeah.
worst part is when they actually like they try to like actually dupe a site or something like that, so it looks exactly like real information.
Right.
So, and that's just, it's so detrimental because not everybody's necessarily looking at like the exact web address or anything like that. They're just, well, it looks like, because there was one I know not that long ago, there was one that somebody had basically done a mirror image of ABC's website, and it was, if you looked at the tag, it was like ABC dot something else instead of dot com,
Yeah.
and so many people fell for it. And it was just because they made it look exactly like that website, and it had all this false information. So like finding stuff on the internet can be really, really difficult. I mean, we've all done it,
Yeah.
right? And we've all tried to
Yeah.
find stuff, and it's so hard sometimes to find good information. So that's kind of the new part to all of this, and people hear it, those still as stories as well.
Yeah. One of the things I always look for is, are they telling two sides of the story? Because I find a lot of the anti-vax rhetoric just has one side, and they don't talk about, the risks and the benefits, and so that's always kind of like a trigger for me.
Yeah.
If you're not explaining this other side of the story, then I don't know that I can really believe this information.
Yeah. And I think that's a great way to look at it. Is to see, like, are we getting both sides of the story here? Is this being covered? And some people, have argued against giving the anti-vaccination movement any kind of voice. But I
Yeah.
think, like, looking at real concerns of people, I think that's important. Because, and I've shifted kind of my thinking a little bit on this during COVID. And I kind of think about it now as like the vaccine hesitant versus like, I started calling them the vaccine hostile. Like, these people will never accept it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they are just totally against vaccination. But there's so many people in that hesitant area that it would be so great if they could find really good information, and
Yeah.
information they can trust. But it's so hard to do that. And
And I think
you
for
know,
me, I think that's the key, where I feel like our mindset has moved, because there's a lot of information about big pharma out there,
mhm,
and reasons why you can't trust these corporations that are creating these vaccines, which seem incredibly reasonable,
mhm,
right?
yeah,
And so like this general degrading of trust, I think,
yeah.
is really harmful for this arena.
Yeah, it is so harmful. And, it's, yeah, it could be really upsetting too, because people are really, they're marketing, and they're making
Mm-hmm.
money off of people's fear and
Yeah.
people's real desire for real information. And that just kind of breaks my heart, because it's parents that are, a lot of times, not always, it could be us too, right? We're looking for information, and we want something that's balanced. We want something that's
Mm-hmm.
good. And I think that's fine. Like, you can give somebody vaccine information, say, here's all the benefits. Yeah, sometimes bad things happen. We're not saying that they
Mm-hmm.
don't, but here's the risk. And like, let's talk about that risk benefit. And I think in so many ways too, it's hard for parents to think of, especially children, and like what they're going to be when they grow up, the things they might
Mm-hmm.
do. And this especially is true of like the HPV vaccine. Parents are like, they don't want to think, especially if they're like tiny, tiny baby, as being
Mm-hmm.
like someone that's going to have sex someday or something like
Right.
that, right? Parents don't want to think about that. They don't want to think about their kids growing up. So when they're like offered some of these vaccines, they're like, well, my child's never going to do that. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, your child is going to probably have sex at some point.
Yeah.
I would hope you would want that for them, but also like
Yeah.
things like, it's always in this really negative way. And I think we should think about it in positive ways too, that like, you need to get your, the full set of vaccines for your kids, because maybe they'll join the Peace Corps, right? And
Yeah.
and they're going into places where, some of these diseases are more common, or, maybe
Mm-hmm.
your child is going to do these amazing things, and they might need these vaccines because of that. But instead,
Mm-hmm.
it's always in this negative way, like my child's going to be an IV drug user or something. Like, no, it's not that.
Yeah.
It's a lot of other things too. And like, think about it in those terms. Like, yes, I want my child to be protected from cancer. I want my child to, have be able to travel and
Mm-hmm.
not have to worry about this stuff. So
Yeah.
yeah, it is. I think, yeah, we think about it too many times too that vaccines have a negative effect. And that's in part too because we never see the positive effect. Like, I don't know how many times I haven't gotten COVID, right?
Mm-hmm.
I just know about the 2 times I got it. But like, I probably didn't get it a whole bunch of times because of my vaccine, but I have no idea, right?
Yeah.
And it's sad that, like, it's hard to know the benefit when you don't see it. And
right.
I've
heard that argument as well used for the EPA. The Environmental Protection Agency has done too good of a job of protecting things so that people don't realize what it looked like prior to the EPA's creation.
Yeah.
And so I think that the same is true of vaccines, right? We don't know how scary vaccine diseases were and how many people died of these horrible illnesses prior to these vaccines. And so, they've kind of done their job so well that we don't have it, a cultural history of a reminder of it.
I think you're 100% right. And even stories like, I mean, I think about like people who got polio or were alive when polio happened. I mean, that was my grandmother's generation, and they're they're gone. They're dying off or they're gone. And like, my mom was vaccinated when she was a kid, and she doesn't even really remember it. So she has no, like, my mother's generation doesn't have any memory of having polio. So like, what happens when we start to lose that cultural memory about what those diseases were like? And this is actually one of those stories that always gets told, especially to med students and everything too. There's always a story about how someone comes in with something and no one can diagnose it. And then like one of the old doctors that like should have retired a long time ago, like comes in and says, "Oh, that's whooping cough. How do you guys not know what whooping cough sounds like?" And it's because they've never heard it.
Right.
So that idea too is that these things are kind of dying out, and we're going to forget. And I mean, I think in part, and this is, I always kind of thought that people needed to see an illness in order to understand. And then COVID happened, and I'm like, oh, maybe not. So maybe my theory was wrong. But I think it's still a little bit right, because I think when people actually had it happen to them, or they had it happen to someone they love, that changed their mind. And I heard a lot of people say that, like, I really didn't believe COVID was that bad until I got it. Or I didn't believe it was that bad until my mom got really sick, or something like that. So I think
the anecdotal evidence.
Yeah, and it does. It really affects us, because I think when we hear a statistic, we never think of ourselves as being the one in a million or whatever. We always think of ourselves in terms of story. And if I can hear about your mom got sick, I immediately think, oh my God, what would I do if my mom got sick? Right? Like, I immediately internalize that, which I don't do with a number or a statistic, right?
Yeah.
But the story, I'm like, oh, how awful would I feel if that happened to me, right? Or how bad would I feel? Or what if I found, and this was something I kept thinking to myself every time I'd want it, like, because of course we all took risks during the pandemic, and every time I was like thinking about taking a risk, I'd be like, but how bad would you feel if you killed like a whole bunch of people by accident, right? And like, you might not even know, or maybe you would. And, you have to think about these things in those technologies, because it wasn't just about us. And I think that was also hard. I don't want to say it like in a negative way. That's also hard for Americans, but we're very good at like short-term things. We're not good at like long, sustainable things.
Yeah.
I hate to say that, but it's true. And so it was hard for us to stay inside for long times, or wear a mask for long periods of time, because that's just not what we do. And I keep hoping these things become more normalized. I hate the term normal, but like, I'll use it here. But like, I hope that things become more common. Because like, I have decided, I'm like, every time I get sick, I'm going to wear a mask. Because why would I want to get other people sick, right? Or what? Like,
well, and it's very normalized in Asia. I remember seeing that in Asia and thinking that was a strange thing. But I think it'll become a little bit more common here. You see people,
I hope so,
putting them on when they have colds and things sometimes.
Yeah, and I'm like, sorry.
Although it sucks wearing a mask when you're coughing.
It does. It's awful. Or sneezing's even worse. But yeah, it's so true. And like, I said to my husband the other day, I was like, I don't know if I'm ever going to get like on public transportation without a mask on again, like, or like, on a plane or anything like that, because I would always go to these conferences or we go on vacation and I'd always get sick, like always. And it's like, I don't know if my body was just like, oh, it's time to relax, let's get sick. Or if it was, I got exposed to something, but I'm like, yeah, I'm going to do this like all the time now because, I haven't, other than I did have COVID twice. And I've just very recently had bronchitis, but I haven't been sick other than that. And that's been great. Right. And I actually found it pretty useful during allergy season too. So it's like, instead of, there's really bad pollen in Eastern North Carolina. And I was like, well, if I just put my mask on, maybe it'll help.
Yeah.
Like maybe it will, maybe it won't. Some of it won't help, but some of it, why not? So I think it would be great if these things become common, or staying home when you're sick. I would love if that became a thing.
Americans can't do that. Although now that we can, at least some people are able to work from home, at least there's that ability to, although a lot of companies are trying to bring people back into the offices and reverse that trend. But I think that, that trend is still going to have some retroactive effects so that people can do work at home, especially when they're sick, but really people shouldn't be working when they're sick. That's just an American thing where we have our work ethic where you just have to power through.
Just suck it up and keep going. And
suck it up.
That's not good for us. Like, so then we're sick longer. Right. And, and that's not good for us. We really should have the ability to take that rest. But a lot of people don't because of their jobs. They're worried about getting fired. They're, all that kind of stuff. And it's funny, like when I think about that, I'm like, I'm a professor. It's not like anybody can like wander in and teach my class for me, right? But I can put it online, right? And if I get sick, I can be like, okay, guys, we're doing it online today. I've done that a few times now. It's like, I've gotten sick. We're going to meet online. I don't want to get you guys sick. And I've even gotten my students occasionally, not always, but occasionally, I'm like, hey, just wear a mask if you get sick and you still want to come to class. But I'll also I'll record it. And like, I will give it to you. Like,
you can watch it from your bed.
Yeah, you can watch it from your bed. That's fine. So I think we're really learning different ways that we can do things. And I hope some of those stick too, because I also think about like stuff like that, but also for people with disabilities, some of them can't participate the same way that the rest of us can, and going out into the world. And this really made things accessible. When we were all stuck at home, we all learned about accessibility, and we found that this is cool. Like, why don't we have more museums that have virtual tours, or why can't we do more of these virtual things? But then we've kind of stopped doing that. And I think, oh, that's so sad, because for a while we were all on the same level, right? We were all able to access things the way that people with disabilities often have to. And that's so deeply unfair now that we've kind of gone back to we're like, oh, sorry, bye, and we've gone back to this. I think we should really be thinking about that for that level
being more
of
inclusive.
Yeah. And I've taught in a online master's program for, like 13 years now. And it's so great to teach in an online program because my students can work. I've also had students who were disabled who have been like, I can't come to campus, but I can do this class online. And I'm like, oh, that's amazing. So I wish, I wish we could like kind of get the best of both worlds in these situations. And I don't know, I hope that's where we're headed, but we'll see.
So let's get into some of the legends from your book. You mentioned zombies, vampires, Slender Man, the kiss of death. I want to hear about all of these legends.
I've always had I've always really liked vampire and zombie stuff. I can't help it. It's just like a personal thing. I'm a little tired of the vampires we've been seeing lately. I want some like gross old school vampires. but yeah, I
love the humane ones.
Yes, I don't want sexy vampires. I want like gross old vampires. Like let's stop with the sexy vampires. I get that they're attractive, but like I'm over it. And then I was like, oh God, someone tried to make zombies sexy. I'm like, let's not. Like let's just leave them being horrible. But yeah, I've always I love monsters. I've always loved monsters, and so yeah, I really enjoy like thinking about that, and for me too, thinking about contagion and contamination with these, especially vampires and zombies, is that idea that it's our loved one, but they've been changed somehow, right? Like they
Mm-hmm.
look human, but they're not, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of linking back to that idea of the asymptomatic carrier, which we saw in COVID. Um, Little did I know we were going to see that in COVID, but there it was. But that idea that things that look human to us, that aren't, is very scary. It's one of our scariest things. It's like that idea that there's like a sleeper cell or something like that happening.
Yeah.
And we see this with disease as well. So the people who are asymptomatic carriers, they appear to be fine. They're not visibly sick, but they have the virus or they have whatever it is. They have vampirism or whatever. And so that idea is so scary to us, I think, because we can't tell just by looking at them. And a lot of, especially if you look at like the older legends and the older even movies about vampires and zombies, so much of it was xenophobic. It was like, oh no, it's the suave outsider. It's the sexy vampire become is like a lot of those were done during a time when a lot of Eastern European immigrants were coming into places, and this
Mm-hmm.
idea that your virginal white woman was going to sleep with these these men was just horrifying to people. And
Yeah.
so, it goes back again, God, so many things go back to stuff that's racist. It's really sad. But it goes back to this sort of racist idea that these women are going to be led away by these people who look human but aren't. And it's like, no, they're just immigrants. Like,
Yeah.
it's so ridiculous. But yeah, so there's so many stories about that. And we've been telling these stories for a long time. And if you look at, like, especially the original vampire narrative, especially if you look at like the old Eastern European folklore, so much of it, if you look at the list of things that can make you a vampire, it's things like, if your property isn't settled before you die. So it's like, get your affairs in order. If you mourn too long or too little, so if you mourn too much or too little, that person could turn into a vampire. So it's also like social norms about grieving, and like, you don't want to
Yeah.
mourn. And it was considered usually a year and a day was like the what you were supposed to grieve. So like you can't do too much, you can't do too little.
Yeah.
So or else vampire. Um, Leaving one of the things was, if animals jump over the corpse. And like, to me, that's probably just like good, like corpse care practice, like,
Yeah.
don't leave it someplace where animals can jump over it. Like,
Yeah.
put it someplace safe, bury it, or burn it or do something with it immediately. Like, don't just let it sit out. So many of these things are like rules of some of them are social rules or social norms. And other things are like good public health and like
Yeah.
this kind of stuff, or like telling you to get your affairs in order. So much of that was like about teaching people, like, this is what you have to do or else you'll turn into a vampire. So, because that seems like the worst case scenario, right? No,
Yeah.
you won't just die, you'll turn into a vampire. You'll
Right.
come back from the dead. So yeah, so some of these stories I think are there for that, that maintenance of culture, right? And to keep social norms, and sometimes for like things like public health, right? So all of these stories kind of remind you of that. And I think that especially the vampire narrative has changed so much from being about that to being more about, hey, look, because so much of the stuff right now, especially with like the romantic vampire, is it's about a woman falling in love with the vampire and then proving to everybody else that he is also at least human in some way. Right.
Right.
So to me, that's an acceptance of outsiders. And like, that's a good narrative. Like, yeah, let's keep going with
Mhm.
that narrative. Like I said, though, I'm still a little bored of it. But it's as a narrative, it's actually a pretty positive one. It's
Yeah.
yeah, at first everybody's not going to accept them, but eventually you're going to win them over and it's going to be okay. And your family will come back to loving you and all that kind of stuff. So it turns into this just totally different narrative where, weirdly, women are in charge of making these big changes in society, which is also kind of
Mm.
interesting, if you think of things
Mhm.
like the Women's March. So yeah, I think there's some of those changes in narrative are good. Like, they're actually much more positive than they've been in the past. And then, yeah, if you get into things like Slender Man, oh my gosh, we are still afraid of teenage girls, which is what I think some of the Slender Man narrative is about.
So I don't know the Legend of Slender Man. Can
All
you
right.
can you give
Yeah,
us
absolutely.
a
Yeah. So the sort of shirt version of it is we can actually track it, like I mentioned, to 2009. It was on the Something Author Forum that a poster, there was like a challenge that was put out that was like, make something creepy. So somebody created two Photoshops of a big tall guy with no face in a black suit, and put like a couple little lines of text that were kind of creepy. And people just ran with it. They absolutely loved it. They thought it was amazing. So more and more people started creating Slender Man or telling stories about Slender Man, or making fan fiction or fan art about it. But the thing that kind of really pushed it sort of out of the internet and into more everyday life, although the internet is everyday life at this point, but kind of took
right?
it out of that screen and put it into not screen, that the
Yeah,
not screen part of our everyday life, that little tiny part,
right.
is was there was a couple of girls in Wisconsin who believed in the narrative, and they ended up stabbing their friend over Slender Man to gain Slender Man's favor, and that's kind of what pushed it into the limelight. And there was no part of the narrative that necessarily said that you had to kill people for Slender Man or anything like that. This was their
Yeah,
interpretation, um,
yeah.
and so that really kind of pushed it into the like I said, into kind of the public sphere. So then
Uh-huh.
everybody was talking about it, and every parent was freaking out that their kids were going to get into Slender Man and not understand the difference between reality and fiction. And
Yeah.
it was really this one case. And it was a very serious case. The little girl that I think she was stabbed 17 times. She lived. She is, I don't want to say she's fine.
Wow.
I'm sure she still has a lot of trauma associated with it, but she is physically okay, as far as I know. The two girls who were participated in the stabbing, I think are still in jail, although they were, I think, put into mental health care facilities. But it was such a big deal because it kind of brought back all those ideas of kids don't realize what's real and what's not real. And
Hmm.
the internet is bad. And it's like, no, the internet's a tool. How we use it is good or bad, right? So there's
Hmm.
all this stuff out there about Slender Man. And of course, when parents hate something, that makes kids all the more interested in it. So there was a sort of rise again in people participating in this narrative. So it turned out to be really interesting, especially watching it happen, like over time. And it's interesting too to think of time as a concept in these things. So I sat and watched it all as an adult, but like a lot of my students remember Slender Man from when they were a kid and remember hearing a story about it, not seeing it online.
Uh-huh.
So for them, it's oral culture. It was a playground game. It was things like that, or something they did at sleepovers. Um,
Yeah.
but for me, it's something that's like completely internet. So it's interesting to kind of see how it because of age and time, it could be different things for different people.
Hmm.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And I decided, I had this idea. I was like, huh, there's all these things that like a list of things that when you've when you've been in contact with Slender Man. And they came across and like people are actually referring to it as slender sickness. And I was like, well, what if I treat that as an actual condition? What are
Yeah.
the symptoms of slender sickness? And so I made a list, and then I started looking at the list and trying to figure out, okay, well, what matches this that we already know about? And it turned out that the symptoms of slender sickness are almost identical to the list of characteristics you'll notice in your children if they're being bullied. And
Oh,
I was like,
wow.
oh, whoa, wait, what's going on here?
Yeah.
And then the more I kind of dove into that, the more I saw that there were so many people thinking of Slender Man in this particular moment in those terms. Like he was something that could help you, or you would have these sort of like revenge fantasies about Slender Man killing off your bullies. But you didn't do it. It was Slender Man, right? So that's out of your control. And like having like, and it was mostly at least people that were presenting as young women, having like writing this fanfic about Slender Man killed my bullies. Slender Man beat up my bullies. Slender Man took
Hmm.
me away from my situation, and now
Hmm.
my life is better. And in some ways, some of them would like go on to say, but it's actually not because it's Slender Man. But other ones didn't say that. They were like, Slender
So
Man
it
killed
was
my bullies, and now my life is
It
better.
was a little ambiguous if he was a villain or a superhero in those
Yeah.
instances.
Very ambiguous. So he was really framed and originally as a villain, right? He was,
Yeah.
and some places too, he wasn't even a villain. He was more kind of like Mothman, where you're like he just shows up and bad stuff, like he's like a harbinger of bad things, right? Like
Uh-huh.
if he shows up, like, oh no, bad stuff's gonna happen. So for some people it was like that. Other people he kind of turned into this thing that would attack people or come after them. But for a lot of people it was more about this idea, this uncanny thing that was frightening. And there was also the other part of Slender Man too, is there's no way to repel him. There's no way to get rid of him. There's no way to do anything about it. Which is a lot like bullying, right? Like, what are you going to do
Yeah.
about it, right? And
Yeah.
it was, and it was so many, especially like I said, like teenagers talking about this and having this issue. And not seeing a way out of it. Like there was nothing
Mm-hmm.
that their parents could do. Like adults were completely ineffective. It was only Slender Man that could help them. And it was so wild to kind of read that and kind of realize that's for some people what was happening. And it wasn't,
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't universal. It's not like everybody who told a Slender Man story was being bullied, but a lot of people
Yeah.
were. And it became like this other way of talking about, especially cyberbullying and that online
Yeah.
bullying. Yeah, because
That's a
that was,
huge thing now.
yeah,
It's
and
so
that was,
frightening to me as a parent.
I can only imagine, yeah, because it is, and that was part of Slender Man. Like Slender Man was always there. Like that was just part of,
Mm-hmm.
and then like to me, I saw that clear thing of like, when I was growing up, if you were bullied, they just go home, right? And like at least at
Yeah.
home, you were hopefully safe, unless you were, of course, being bullied at home. But for like if you were being bullied at school, there was an escape, right? You knew it was going to
Yes.
happen again tomorrow, and that sucked. But like at least you could get away from it. But with cyberbullying, it's always
Just keeps
around, right?
going.
Just like Slender Man, it
Mm-hmm.
just keeps going, and there's no escape from it. So I saw that like that clear thing that was happening, that they saw both of these things in that way is something you can't escape. So
Mm-hmm.
I was like, oh wow, this is disturbing and wild. And yeah, it was a really interesting thing to kind of realize, and that's what I did. I just kind of sat down and went, okay, they're giving a list of symptoms. What does this match in the
Mm-hmm.
non supernatural world? And it gave me a pretty big insight. So
Wow.
yeah, so I'd like to see other people do that with other things. I'm not sure what
Yeah.
yet, but I think there's some place to do that. But yeah, and then for other people, Slender Man was like this. I mean, they made fun of him, and he was like this like silly figure, and people were dressing up as him for Halloween, and there's all this different stuff. And then eventually there was a movie made, and I feel like after that nobody was interested anymore. They were like,
Oh,
nope,
there's a
it's reached its
movie.
peak. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, there's
interesting.
actually there was like a movie that didn't use the word Slender Man because they actually copyrighted it at one point, and then there
Mm-hmm.
was a movie that used Slender Man too. And there's been other sort of like parodies and like offshoots. It's like it's not Slender Man; it just happens to look exactly like him, and that kind of stuff that have kind of come out. But I feel like there was like a couple of movies like that, and then it's just like people are like, "Now we're done." And,
Yeah. Yeah. It's run its course for the time being. And then maybe
mhm,
it'll come back at a certain
it might
point and
come back.
change.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's sort of like the clown thing that we had going on for a while.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, these
Yeah.
creepy clowns were everywhere, and then they disappeared again. And
Yeah.
so yeah,
What about The Kiss of Death, the title of your book?
yeah. So yeah, this was a set of legends. I started realizing I was reading all these legends about people who would die after being kissed, and I was like, some of these stories seem alike, but then other ones are just like nothing like this. So I was like, well,
Yeah.
I'm going to sit down and start looking at, like any narrative that has a kiss in it and then somebody dies or almost dies. And I started putting all this together in like a chart because there were so many of them. I had to, like, it took me a while to like, oh my God, what have I done? Like that moment.
Yeah.
So I started collecting all these different narratives and like looking for them in books and in archives. And I brought together all of them and again put them in a chart. Like this is what I do. I put things in a chart and I started
Yeah.
dividing them up by different things. And I thought, oh my gosh, the thing I noticed that even though some of these stories were vastly different, um, it seemed like if you were kissed by somebody that you cared about or loved, you were
Yeah.
definitely dying. But if you were kissed by somebody that like maybe you just met, or something that where it wasn't like as intimate, you probably weren't going to die. So it's like the closer you were to them, there's like a sliding scale of like kisses versus
Yeah.
death. And it seemed like the closer you were to the person, the more you cared about them, the more likely they were to die. And I was just like, this is weird. What's going on here? So I started to kind of like look at these legends more and more, look at the details of them. And, so many of them were interesting because they were sort of tales of warning, and like reminders of things, especially like the more modern versions of them, which was like, there was one in particular about a parent who kisses their baby, their like just born baby. And they actually have an active case of herpes simplex. So like on
Uh,
their mouth or something like that, it gets transferred to the baby and the baby dies because the baby is too young to kind of deal with this.
yeah.
And there's been other ones too, where like the child's been a little bit older, same thing kind of happens. And it's always a parent or a grandparent or something like that. So that was one that was really common. But one of the ones that I really thought was interesting, it was actually based off of this real case of this woman. She was, I think she was in Quebec, but her name was Christina Deforge, and she had died of anaphylactic shock um, and they believed it was from a kiss from her boyfriend who had just eaten a peanut butter sandwich before she had gotten there, and she was allergic to peanuts. And they thought that it was because of that's what she died of,
Uh,
from that. And it was really interesting because I had heard this story, and I had kind of like, oh wow, okay, yeah, that's something to think about, like that you can pass the proteins from like peanuts or something like that along to somebody else via a kiss. And like, when a lot of other people were reading about that, they were thinking like, oh, okay, this was like a really small town, maybe the coroner didn't get the diagnosis right. It's unlikely that could happen. It's more likely that it was contaminated surface or something along those lines. But this
mhm,
whole story got really, really intense about this girl. And it was so interesting too, because she almost became like a kind of patient zero for this, because she started
mhm,
to get blamed for this. And a lot of what was said about her is that when she went into anaphylactic shock, I think it was 3 a.m, and they were like, well, what was she doing at her boyfriend's house at 3 a.m? So then it
yeah,
became this whole thing that like, well, maybe it wasn't from the kiss, maybe it was from semen or from something.
yeah.
And so there was all this like slut shaming that started happening for this poor woman,
Mhm,
and all this other stuff. And it was like, oh my gosh, why are we reacting like this to this story? And it's in part,
mhm,
again, so if I just don't do that, then I'm protected, right? But
right.
then it started to morph into this story where her name got dropped entirely from it. It was just a woman that this happened to. So she like this very real story about this person sort of turned into a legend. And now, if you look it up, it's almost hard to find her name. You can find things,
Mhm,
and a lot of people called it the peanut butter kiss. So
mhm,
you can find things about the peanut butter kiss, and especially on like allergy forums and like places like that. But
yeah,
you don't see so much about her as a person, and we see that a lot with legend, where it's not a specific person that's identified anymore. It just becomes this woman or this
yeah,
person that this happened to, and that legendary process is like already happened to this poor woman. And even some of the, like when this all first came out, there were no pictures of her or anything like that. And I've even seen pictures associated with her now. I'm like, I don't think that's her because it's like a generic, like, young woman picture. And
yeah,
it's like, and I've seen different ones, and I'm like, I don't even think this is her, but people are using a picture to kind of give it some like credit. It's like, look, it's real. Here she is,
right.
instead of like that sort of legendary status. So yeah, it was really interesting to watch kind of a live action being kind of divorced of her name and becoming more legend. And so how it's told is really interesting. And we still don't really know the truth of what happened to her.
Right.
It could have been an asthma, because she also had asthma, so it could have been an asthma attack as well. But it looked like she couldn't breathe. So anaphylaxis and an asthma attack would have looked pretty similar. So
Mhm,
it's we still don't know the truth of it, but there's been a lot of studies done that show that, yeah, like peanut proteins can be still there.
mhm,
So it's possible that other common allergens could have done this, but it's so rare that it probably never happened. But yeah, again, it was most likely like a contaminated surface, something like that. But yeah, there's so many other ways to think about this. And again, so many times in urban legends, women get blamed for something.
Yeah.
They're out too late, they're doing something they shouldn't be doing, all that kind
They
of stuff.
asked for it.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, so same kind of thing there. So it really was interesting how this real case kind of turned into this legend.
And so we're running late on time. So I really want to ask where you feel like folklorists can fill in the gaps in public health.
Oh yeah.
Where do you see like your role or other folklorists' role in helping, public health messaging?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because there's so many places we could jump in. And like one of the ones I told people during the pandemic, I was like, folklore should help you there contact tracing, because we understand network and we understand how people interact. So I was like, we all need to, like, if you don't have a job, go be a contact tracer right now if you're a folklorist, because that we're going to be great at that. And some people actually took me up on that, and they did, and they were great at it. So I think we understand how people move and how stories get around, and how stories get around is very very similar to how viruses get around, right? Face-to-face contact, having that, that spread that can really happen, but also understanding how people move and how they relate to each other, and how it's impossible to keep people apart, right? They're going to find some way to get together, but not only like watching that, but also suggesting like, okay, so you can't get together in person. Like, here's how you can do something else that'll, make you feel like you're close to these people, but not actually with them. So like, suggesting those, like the Zoom happy hours that we all went to and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I think we're also really good for, because we know these stories, we know the structure and the format, we know the common things that happen in them. All of that makes us really good at identifying these things before they happen. So I put out a video, I think it was like early March or mid-March, end of 2020, about like the kind of things we were going to see. And it turned out to be like the details were different, but yeah, it was the same stuff. Like it's going to patient zeros. We're going to see blame. We're going to see like all these things. So if you know what the narratives are going to look like, you can help make sure that the bad narratives don't get out there, or at least change them in some way, or you can like address those things before they come up, right? So you can put out information. There's a little bit of a risk there, of course, too, because we don't want to introduce information that people haven't thought of yet and then give them a new thing to be afraid of.
Yes.
We don't want to do that. But there's easy ways to respond to that and talk to people about like, okay, when you hear something like this, like look for these things, right? Like look for this stuff, like make sure they're showing, like you said, like both sides of the story. Like, oh, who are they talking about? Can you find the original version of this? Can you like look at other places on the internet? Has anybody already debunked this? Like, like look for that kind of stuff. So I think, like knowing these kinds of narratives like folklorists do, we can really jump in and say like, okay, here's what's going to happen from a rumor standpoint. Let's work on that. Let's talk about ways to counteract that. Let's talk about ways that we can, hopefully make this work in our favor, or the favor of public health, so that we can influence this in a good way. So I think, that's part of it. We work with communities, and every community is going to have a different response to something like this happen.
Right, because they have different concerns.
Yeah, exactly. So like a big, like widespread, like all Americans, here's your public health message. It's not going to work, right? You have to individualize it to community if you want it to be really specific. So, you could get local communities involved and say like, well, this is what I've been hearing. Okay, great. Well, let's tweak this public health campaign for your area. Right. And for the things that you know and understand that are part of what people are afraid of and what their concerns are, because the concerns were different in different places. Right. So, we can kind of come in and help with that and help them find like people in the community that are really good for this. I was really I was looking at ways to kind of help during all of the COVID pandemic. And one of the things I actually found that was really something that happened by accident, and I thought, oh my gosh, why didn't I think of this earlier, is restaurants. Especially if you're talking about ethnic restaurants in a community that has like maybe just a small amount of people from that group. that can be like a meeting place, like for them, like, or it could be someplace like a church, or it could be whatever, whatever the place is that people meet, going to those places and talking to them. So I ended up in a situation where I went to a particular restaurant all the time. The owner knew me and was like, "Hey, you know a lot about this stuff. Like, what do you think about the COVID vaccine?" And I was like, "Well, I got it. Like, I think it's a good idea. Like, let's do this." And since I was trusted by this trusted member of the community, then he was able to tell a whole bunch of other people, like, "Hey, I know somebody that says it's fine, and I really trust them." And because people trusted him, then that spread, right? So the positive things can spread too. So like finding those places in the community where you can kind of say, "Hey, you trust me, and other people trust you. Like, let you and I talk about it, and then you can spread this information." So yeah, that kind of stuff. I think that's another place we can come in. But there's like a million other ideas.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this was so much fun. I'm so glad we had you on, and I feel like, I mean, I only got through, like, I don't know, 5 of my 12 questions. So, well, we might have to bring you on at a later date, and we can discuss different angles. But
all right,
I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, of course.
And thank you, Folka Knights, for joining us on this wild medical ride. We will be linking everything that we discussed, her book, and also maybe the video that you made in the beginning, and some of the there was something else. We'll have to think about all the things that we'll link on our website, which is www.fabricoffolklore.com. You can find everything there. So what legends had you heard about, or narratives had you heard prior to this conversation around the pandemic or around the medical field? We'd love to hear from you. We have a Facebook page specifically set up so that people can have these conversations, and that's the Fabric of Folklore community. So this is where we invite you to have conversations and tell us your thoughts about our podcast and what you want to hear about as well. So please definitely find us there. We're also on Twitter and Instagram. I just made a Twitter site because several of our guests are primarily live on Twitter. I believe that's where you live as well, on Twitter. So thanks so much. And one of the best ways that you can help a burgeoning podcast like ourselves is to like, comment, share with your friends, give us reviews, give us all the stars, and give us a review. If you give us a review, I will shout out your name on our podcast. So definitely write us the reviews and you'll get to hear your name. So thanks so much for unraveling the mysteries of folklore with us. And until next time, keep the folk alive.